everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead at SportsPro Madrid, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, we are a podcast, and I'm going to start the podcast by talking about podcast. It won't be surprising to anybody listening. I have quite a few sports podcasts, to talk about, NFL breakdowns, talk about fantasy sports. I've got a really good podcast for West Ham where they actually talk about the analytics of football. It's not just fan reactions. It's good. It's positive. I listen to a couple podcasts about books, Nick, because I just simply don't have enough time to join a book club. So it's nice to read a book and have someone sort of read along. But I actually got into a new podcast genre this week and absolutely smashed 8 episodes of my first murder mystery podcast, Nick.
Oh, murder mystery. God,
Yeah.
what's the story? What how do they deliver it? I'm really interested. I actually used to listen to one called, was it Serial?
I think I've heard something about similar to that, yeah.
Yeah.
So interestingly, I actually think it's a nice little kind of mini segue to what we talk about, on Sports Pro about how you find content. So I actually found a TikTok, and it was about, a set of hikers that went missing in the Colombian rainforest, and ended up finding their bodies. And it all goes, as you can imagine, little murder, government supposedly covering up and all this. So then I was like, oh, I want to hear more about this because it's only a 60-second TikTok video. So then I go in the comments and someone's like, oh, someone did a really good podcast series on this. And then bam, I went from TikTok over to Spotify. And the next thing you know, I've listened to 8 episodes, hearing about these hikers, and they're basically sort of trying to review it. And it almost runs like a Netflix murder documentary series. If you've ever watched any of those, making a murder and stuff like that, where, they give you the introduction episode of everything that's happened. They give you, where it's all gone wrong. And then they start breaking it down piece by piece, and they interview different people. So like I said, it was an 8-part episode, murder mystery, hikers, bodies gone missing. And but I think it was just a perfect example of, you start on TikTok, you find something, you search it, you end up on Spotify consuming something else. And Nick, it was good.
Did they tell you on the TikTok to review, subscribe, or whatever you're supposed to do on the podcast we don't do enough of?
Well, no, they didn't do it on the TikTok, but they did do it on the podcast quite frequently. So yeah, there you go. If you're listening to the StreamTime Sports podcast and you're not subscribed to it, you should go do that.
And give us a give us a review, please, because the more the merrier. We definitely have a lot more people listening than we do proportionally to the reviews we get. That is for sure. Now, the Serial one I listened to years ago, and it was a similar sort of model. And I do really think that type of storytelling is so powerful in that format. You do have to really focus on the pods, because sometimes I listen to content, and the same way we do watching video content, sports, and the like, is it's background music or background video as well. Sometimes you might have it on the TV, but you're not really paying a lot of attention. Maybe for example, with sports, don't want to alienate fans here, but maybe sports like baseball or even the NFL sometimes, because sometimes there's a lot of breaks in play. You're not really focused all the time. Just in the background, and if something happens, you pay more attention to it. And I think these are the types of shows that really have to immerse you, and you really have to focus all your attention on. You can lose key parts of the story. And I just think that those types of genres are really interesting, particularly when there's so much going on in people's worlds, and this constant conversation we're having around the attention economy, and people yo-yoing between, Gen Z, millennials, and the young people don't have attention spans. And then other people saying, well, they do, your content's just not good enough. And I just think it's an interesting balance to work out what future these types of models have, because of the mass scale challenge everyone's looking at with content these days. But all more forward. Keep me up to date with who did it.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's to your point. I just had a few things going on this weekend, so I spent a lot of time on the tube on the underground. So to your point, I was able to really kind of lock in and sort of listen to. Whereas my sports ones, those are the ones I listen to while I do work, because football is such background noise to me. I don't even really listen to it. But to your point, I was on the tube, and then I had to drive to a football game. So had some good just alone time, and just went all the way through. But I agree. The storytelling element of it, there's some people that really do those narratives really well in terms of some of the voice acting and things like that.
Big time. I actually find it interesting, before we jump into the content side, or what we want to talk about today, is that I really actually struggle, and I think this is a byproduct of the world we live in today. I struggle if I don't have any music on while I'm working. If I'm working on something, I kind of need it. It's almost like white noise for me to get focused. Is I need music playing in the background to, if I'm going to sit and stare at a spreadsheet or stare at and put together a report, I need some background noise to keep me focused. It's really quite sad. And maybe that means I just need a big, massive digital detox to rewire my brain back into focusing on one task at a time. But without music, I really struggle to keep my head focused on one thing for enough time, which is quite sad, really.
Well, something I want to figure out from YouTube, and maybe I could use ChatGPT or someone to find the answer. There's a YouTube page called, I think it's like Lo-Fi Chill Hip Hop, and it's just a video that plays like 24 hours, like never stops. And like, I just want to know how much money they're making off of advertising, because like, I'm pretty
Mm,
sure it's a woman that actually runs the page. So like, it runs 24 hours. I think she's even like branched into like different thematics. Like, there's like lo-fi beats, there's jazz beats, but like, she's got millions of subscribers, and she just plays it nonstop 24 hours. And I'm curious to know how much ad money she makes off of that, Nick.
would be a pretty disturbing experience if you're getting served ad breaks in the middle of the live stream all the time, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you would, but like at the end of the day,
I
like,
guess pre-roll, come onto the platform and get served an ad to when you arrive, at least. But
yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know. I'm trying. It's Lo-Fi Girls YouTube channel. But yeah, it's just the same thing playing nonstop. She's got 14.6 million subscribers, Nick. So
Jeez.
whatever she's doing, these, as you say, you just need that like background music, just something real chill. Like, I'm looking at her YouTube page right now. She got 6 live channels going at the moment. It's Halloween season, so she's got a Halloween spooky beats to get chill to playlist going. But like, yeah, I mean, I
Damn.
would wonder how much money she's making by just like playing these like on repeat for 24 hours.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to question her model because it clearly is working well.
Yeah.
So that's pretty impressive numbers, that's for sure. And it's cool. It looks like they've just got the like an animated sort of cartoon
Yeah.
of a girl. That's interesting. Interesting model. Well worth a check out. Lo-fi girl. I'll do some
Yeah.
listening to that next time I need to get some
Yeah.
work done and see if it
Yeah.
delivers.
Yeah, just some chill beats, Nick. But I mean, maybe that leads us nicely into our next topic, where we're going to spend a little bit of today talking about SportsPro Madrid. And one of the things we'll talk about at SportsPro Madrid is monetization models and content. And obviously, Lo-Fi Girl has absolutely mastered her area within that. But, speaking first, we'll do the bit where Nick said we don't do enough talking about ourselves a little bit. But the SportsPro Madrid event obviously means a lot. It's near and dear to Nick and I's heart. But one thing I do want to say, there's still time to come attend the event. And through StreamTime, we can offer a 30% discount to the event. So if you go to SportsPro Madrid website, you're a member of our newsletter, I'm sure you'll have seen links to it. If you use the code StreamTime30, all one word, you can get a 30% discount pass to the event, and you can hang out with Nick and I in person, which we would love to actually, speak to people. We've done some luncheons with people that are, subscribers to the podcast. It's really great to meet people in person. So I would definitely say, if you can make it, if you're based in Europe, find a reason to make it out to Madrid. It's a great time, great city. But yeah, Nick, you and I, we're just going to talk a little bit more about the sports ecosystem and what we think are going to be the big hot topics when we get to Madrid, because whenever we get there, there's always lots of people, lots of opinions, lots of people looking for answers. And we kind of just want to go through a little bit what we think those things are going to be. So maybe, Nick, just start off, I know last year was the big change, but it probably is still worth sort of driving home the change of the event from Sports Pro OTT Summit to Sports Pro Madrid.
Yeah, I look at this event that we run in Madrid as kind of a reflection of. It's like a snapshot in time of where the industry is at that moment. And what I mean by that is, when we launched that event 6-7 years ago, I might even be 8 now, there was such excitement and buoyancy around what OTT was going to bring to the industry in the world of streaming that's why we delivered this event. It was related to what the industry was excited and interested in. But what we've been on this journey year on year is the adoption and the understanding of the role that OTT and streaming has placed and plays in the industry today has been evolving over time, and its success stories and the role it plays and the maturity, I guess, of how some of the major players in the market are approaching it is evolving. Some have had several iterations of that journey, but where we've got to the last few years is it's become clear is that as an industry, as well as ourselves, we have to stop looking at OTT and streaming through a silo and looking at it's just sitting over here doing its thing, servicing a certain type of person. Every sports property that we talk to, every broadcast that I talk to, is looking at everything they do across the entire media spectrum to determine their approach and strategy. So that whether that is what they do through social media channels, through free distribution mechanisms like maybe fast TV, through their own operator platforms, and the various big tech giants that are out there doing different things. There are all sorts of these different approaches that are happening, not to mention the traditional ones of linear and free-to-air and pay TV. So we are really making sure that what we're doing with this pod is one of the reasons we made sure this podcast itself wasn't just focused on one subsector of this space, is because every sports property, every broadcaster is looking at the whole landscape, because sometimes it might be that you need to do more on the OTT space on your own and operated because you aren't getting enough value out of other areas. But if you have to recalibrate and you're doing way more through your broadcast partnerships, then maybe you drop what you're doing on the OTT streaming side or on the social side. So you have to look at the full picture. And that's why this event has been so crucial, I think, for the industry and indeed for us, to stay connected with how to approach all those different plates that we're all spinning to try and make sure we have the best ultimate media strategy, no matter where you sit in the industry. So yeah, that's really the guise of this event. It's not just about OTT or streaming. It is about the whole media spectrum on the business side and the technology side, and how technology is serving some of those and solving some of those commercial challenges along the way.
One of my favorite things about Madrid is the diversity of the event. We get people from all over the globe. We get the big organizations, and then you think about in Switzerland all the Olympic federations that are there, and then all the second, third tier football, soccer leagues that exist. It's not that the New York event isn't fun, but the US can be a little bit more monolithic in terms of where the money goes with the big sports, the big broadcasters, where in Europe it's so much, at least I find it, more diverse and fragmented. And one of the points you made talking about, how you split up your media pie, where if you're one of the tier ones, you might make all your money in traditional broadcast. But for example, the NFL, the people that are working on the domestic side, yeah, they probably are just working with free to air, the big streamers, but they are only a second tier, third tier property in Finland. So how does their broadcast strategy differ? And that's why I think it's such an interesting event, is that regardless of what size you are, because of the global nature of Madrid, like your strategy is not going to be the same in one market as another. And I think you don't get those sorts of learnings as much as what you do as in Madrid. And I think that's a really interesting part of the event, is how diverse the people that are in attendance, the people that are speaking, and just that global perspective that I don't think we get at a lot of other events.
No, I don't know of any of the events like it. Like, I know there's other events that have a sports media focus, but this is really the melting pot of where you're going to get so many different examples, both on stage and off it, of how different sports properties, platforms, big and small, are all approaching a really complex sports media landscape. And we've seen what's been happening in media at a macro level for some time, where the valuations of major media businesses has been challenged. Prices have been slashed in the US stock market. We've seen a consolidation of a lot of major tech businesses, and probably seeing a bit more of that on the media front, and a lot of changes in models to try and monetize this landscape, where we've all worked out that the subscription model alone is not enough. You have to be diversified in everything you do. And so that's really exciting to talk about, because there's some great examples of what people are doing that is really working. And that is mixing everything from people using a really broad platform approach to doubling down on just on a platform like YouTube, to doing third-party deals with all sorts of major broadcasters and aggregation deals, to a whole bunch of different platforms to make sure you're everywhere. Everyone is taking a slightly different approach. And then you've got people like the NFL, who still continues to find new ways of carving out new rights to sell to other markets. So companies, big and small, are doing different things that I think everyone can learn from, and you just have to be able to distill that into what's relevant for you. And that's what I think this event is so good for. And also, just I guess the bigger thing is that the tech side is a big challenge here, because sports is not just trying to work out the business strategy, but then it's also trying to work out how to deliver against these things. And quite often, sports does have an expertise gap, and as well as a technology gap, on how to deliver excellence in some of these areas, be it monetization or streaming delivery. And that's where this event is really where you can find all of that. At the frustration, sometimes a lot of those companies that aren't working in sports are going, why does sports not understand what we're talking about? But that's why this event tries to exist, to try and serve and solve some of those knowledge gaps that exist in sports, in the sports media industry.
So in terms of talking about an event being for everybody, let's sort of maybe break it down by individual groups and maybe kind of forecast what we think are the biggest challenges that they're facing right now, or what we think are going to be key topics that are brought up. And I guess the first one we'll start with are kind of the broadcast and the streamers. You talked about, being a year-on-year event. I remember, seeing DAZN 5 years ago versus seeing DAZN now, and it's night and day with those problems, where it used to be at the time they were just trying to get subscribers, and now the big word that you hear them talking about quite a bit is profitability. Obviously growth is part of profitability, but it's certainly a completely different mindset to what they are. So, DAZN is just one example, but for the broadcast streamers type, what do you right now see as kind of their biggest headaches or biggest challenges they're needing to solve at the moment?
It feels like the problem that they are still trying to solve as it relates to the use of sports is really how to maximize the monetization value of those rights. So you look at, for example, even sports like football. Like football is grossly under monetized still through streaming platforms, because one of the special source, let's say, of streaming as it relates to something like football is the ability to now serve more advertising in different ways and shapes and forms during a broadcast or a live stream. But football is still heavily regulated, where you can't do a lot of that still. You have to still serve the 90 minutes with uninterrupted, excluding for the halftime breaks and alike. So there's that opportunity. How else can you drive revenue and monetization around a sports property's live broadcast production, whether it be through your own channels or using a whole host of other different channels to that you have access to, i.e., using YouTube, and then using YouTube's tools to drive e-commerce sales, to drive general YouTube ad revenue, or the value of building bigger follower bases on those requisite platforms. Or is it doing distribution deals with other platforms and basically losing the tentpole, the value that your platform used to have as a destination for anyone to come to just for those set of rights? Well, now it's available in a whole host of different places just to maximize the breadth and reach that you need. So it's getting your content as many places as possible. It seems to be the theme of the day, and then generating as much possible revenue out of it. That seems to be really the focus, which it always is. But I think now there's more areas that's happening. It used to be just maximizing the value from perhaps from a subscription perspective. What's your ARPU? What's your cost of customer acquisition cost? All those things. Well, now they're just getting way more complex because they're looking at so many different places to drive more value. And finally, I just think the role of advertising, particularly as it sits in European markets, is still really only at its early stage. The streaming space is still struggling to see the growth in advertising spend that you would expect to see or have seen in markets like the US. And that's what I think everyone's waiting for, to see the buoyancy come from brands spending bigger and bigger in the streaming space. And sports seems like the best driver of eyeballs and emotion, and being the best asset for a brand to spend more money on when it comes to advertising in the streaming space. So I still think that's what everyone's trying to gear up for, or to try and push together to try and make it happen.
So if you had to ballpark it, Nick, because I agree with you, you can't just mimic the NFL, because the nature of the sport, as you say, the amount of stops and TV breaks, you couldn't just add that money into your revenue. But let's say all of a sudden the Premier League said, yes, we will have dynamic ad insertion where, like, we won't cut away, but we'll show like a 30-second commercial that just takes up the bottom left-hand corner, be as minimally invasive as possible. How much do you think that could drive? Put a ballpark percentage. We're talking 10%, 20%. Like, how much is that actually worth, you think?
Well, okay, it gets really tricky because at the moment there's a reason why in-stadia advertising is so expensive. So you see all the signage, around the edge of the football stadium. People basically, that's their way of buying advertising or buying inventory, and that's what you've seen. If you see what they've done in a lot of other stadiums now, they're adding like 2 or 3 layers of signage around the pitch, and some of them are even double height now. So they're much more in your face than they've ever been. And that's partially because of that reason. So I think it honestly could have, depending on how it's approached, a 10 to 20% impact on advertising revenue, not a 10 to 20% impact on
Broadcast
how
values.
broadcast revenue more generally. That being said, I don't know quite enough about this space. My sense of what I've seen around how brands look at advertising and how sports is trying to sell, which is very ad hoc, I feel like that type of advertising would be something that brands will be more likely to adopt than paying for branding around the side of a pitch. You know what I mean? Because it's more measurable and aligns with the ways branding advertising is measured currently through YouTube and other channels, through traditional views and the like. So I don't know enough how good the science is around selling that advertising today around in Stadia, but my guess is it would open up the floodgates for more brands to spend more money in this space because it would align more greatly with how brands would measure the requisite value brought from advertising. And I think also in some instances that advertising is sold around the pitch side advertising, I think is the word I'm trying to get to, is sometimes done, depending on the leagues, it's done at a club by club level, not at a league level, or at a broadcast platform level. Now, you imagine you scale that up with a well-oiled advertising selling machine, that you're more likely to get more bang for your buck out of some of those deals. What is also interesting at the moment, and I don't know how far we're along with this from a tech perspective yet, is that there's companies like Sapono. Okay, I used to know that, and I've now forgotten which one they are. There's a couple of companies that also do that sort of thing, which is basically they serve that pitch side advertising, and it changes market by market. So you can serve advertising around the pitch in Germany, which can be different to France, can be different to China, etc., which allows you to sell the same inventory over again and again and again. So that needs to be really strong and robust if they want to go back to more native advertising on the pitch than what's currently being served. But I think it could open up significant revenue streams if they do find really open up the floodgates and remove some of the legislation restrictions that are currently in place.
For sure. Now, if we move it to looking at some of the biggest challenges for leagues, this can both be big and small. The things that stick out, I mean, I think the first one that stands out, because we've spoken about it on a couple of different podcasts, and last year we had Ben Morrell, who was, I believe he was acting as the CEO at the time for Ligue 1, and that was before the current set of deals that they've got in place. Is just, at least in Europe, things are starting to stagnate a little bit, whereas in the US, pretty much almost everybody now, except for maybe one deal, is left, or in terms of being locked down. I think, is there just after the NBA? Is it still maybe the NHL that's got to do? There's not. They're pretty much locked down. So we're almost like in two sides, where the U.S. is kind of locked down for the seeming future, although the NFL, as you say, keeps finding a way to cut up its rights. Whereas Europe is seeming to be a little bit of a stagnated period, but partially because it can't drive any competition, which is what you mentioned. About the streamers, there's not a lot of streaming of football, so like there's not a lot of competition to drive up prices. So for the individual leagues, what do you right now kind of see as their biggest headache challenge, the type of thing that they're maybe hoping to find some inspiration coming to Madrid?
I think the line has now been firmly drawn in the sand that almost no rights owner is expecting media rights to be a growing source of revenue. And we've covered it ad nauseum on that situation, where they've now accepted it. They've come through, I don't know, the 4 stages of change or grief or whatever you want to call it, but they basically now come to the point that, all right, well, we have to double down on all the other areas we need to be focused on. So even the shift for sports teams and leagues to be a well-oiled media and entertainment machine is now really coming to the fore, supported by new technology and initiatives like through AI and e-commerce tools that are available both direct and through big tech platforms like your YouTubes and other social media platforms to basically drive huge audiences at scale and find every way you can to monetize them through traditional means, but also the greater adoption of digital assets for sponsors to use and lean into. That's still only at the early stages, where we've seen brands really adopt and maximize the value of whether it be just different types of sponsorship assets that are available on platforms across all their major social media assets. Typically, what we're seeing the most lucrative area of that spend being driven to is sponsored content. So basically, rights owners need to be effectively quasi-media agencies to sell, here's an idea we've got to do, which could be, let's say, the traditional playbook might be, oh, here's a behind the scenes with X couple of stars, or we do something fun, connected with some fans, and you can have your brand associated with it. That sort of playbook is that they're going out to a lot. So they're trying to sell sponsorships. They're leaning to content creation, distribution of that content, and that's a primary source of revenue for their digital media assets. But now we're at this tricky apex. I think it is a tricky one where I think we covered it when we talked about AI a few weeks back, but they're trying to work out where to spend and where to cut costs to try and grow audiences and to try and drive more revenue, because you can't just keep throwing money. They're all very pragmatic already. They're very cautious about investing into any new technologies without some sort of VIK or commercial component coming back from the sell side. So sports is a bit of a tricky point where they're all really aware they have to be really bustling media entertainment businesses if they want to drive commercial partnerships and value, but they're getting a little bit unsure about where to spend their money and their time most, and that's creating some real tricky headaches for a lot of those sports teams and leagues that we see at events like ours.
Well, with the team specifically, it is interesting. It feels like the owned and operated platforms is sort of almost trickled itself down where it felt like, Sky had Sky Go as their owned and operated platform. The NFL started to have, NFL League Pass, things like you saw that. But it does feel like more and more teams are starting to take that approach. I mean, I think some of the Italian football clubs, Juventus and AC Milan are spending a ton of money building these in-house sort of platforms, and Tottenham have Spurs play, and like it feels like the owned and operated platform space is starting to multiply more across the team level. And whether that is something that they're looking to directly monetize through subscriptions, whether that's something that's a part of a larger play of just collecting first party data to monetize in other places, it does feel like I've come across more teams headed down that way than there was maybe 5 years ago. I don't know if you feel the same way about that, Nick.
I feel like we've been on a journey with it. I'd say a few years ago, there was a real interest. And then everyone's like, oh, crap, we've actually got not many rights to do anything with. Are we going to be able to make a lot of money selling people access to exhibition games and that alone? But now that I think as an industry, we've really matured our ability to create great content, storytelling around the edges of it. So let's say the Drive to Survive effect of just documentary storytelling, behind the scenes storytelling that some clubs are really good at. Having that being funneled into some of your owned and operated at times to create another destination to build a more direct relationship with fans, married with a more realistic expectation of what commercial return it's going to give, then I think we're in a much healthier place to where it was, where everyone was hoping it was a big silver bullet, right? The one that was going to generate all this new additional supplementary media revenue. So I think the trick is basically something along the lines: if you need a destination to super serve a group of fans, that super serving group of fans gives you a monetization channel, and also does give you a data channel, because you can learn enough. You can get a core rate of people that's significant enough to say, all right, well, our fans, we've got, let's say, X thousands of fans that are paying for this access to this platform, and maybe some of it's on free to access as well. But you've got this data pot. You can then say, look to sponsors and brands who want to associate with the club. This is the type of people you can get to, and then you can market them through the non owned and operated platforms. But you've got enough of an insight as to who those people are that your potential clients and partners want to talk to. So that mix is, I think, where we've got to, whereas it plays a role of intelligence, a bit of a role of marketing for super serving fans. It's just never going to be that silver bullet that everyone was hoping it to be. But because we're better at content creation now, we can do more with it than we could, say, 5 to 10 years ago.
Well, that kind of brings us into the three pillars for the event. We've sort of talked about, the different levels with which this event touches, but then the actual event itself has sort of three key pillars between monetization, content, technology. I want to come back to your point around the Drive to Survive. When that all came out, that really felt like everyone's got to do that, and then it felt like we became oversaturated with it. And I agree with you, whether it's through, generative AI or different things they're doing on social media, like I say we, I'm going to pretend like I'm in the industry, Nick. It feels like are all creating more content, efficient content, but it does feel a little bit like no one sort of sees it as like, hey, we're going to create the next Drive to Survive. It almost feels like everyone's come to the realization that similar to, you can't just, mimic what the NFL does from a monetization model. You're not going to be able to just mimic what Drive to Survive did and expect the same results, because a lot of people came out with it. PGA Tour's done stuff, ATP's done stuff. Like there's been multiple people along the line, but no one's ever quite hit that level. And it feels like the industry's kind of figuring out there's different approaches to take to content now.
Big time. I just think that Drive to Survive was super well timed. It just came at the perfect moment of there not being enough of this type of behind the scenes stuff made available, that F1 had a massive gap in the access to the drivers, to the teams, and it's such a unique, F1's in such a unique place where the business side, and you're hearing from the principals and hearing from some of the executives that work in F1, is really interesting to a fan, really interesting all the time, no matter what you are. Even if you're not a fan of that team, you still want to hear from a Christian Horner or a Toto Wolff and those types of big name. They're based stars, right? They have been stars even before Drive to Survive came about. It's just a perfect melting pot for something like this to come into the market at the perfect time. But we haven't seen anyone really replicate this model at all, because it can be difficult. There's also, you have to put yourselves in the eyes or in the seats of, say, some of the decision makers around this stuff. If you're a sports property looking to bring this to life, you've got so many stakeholders to keep happy with this type of approach. You normally politically you can't risk alienating too many of those different stakeholders. Where if it is a third party producing some of this stuff, you don't care as much. You just want good entertainment, which Drive to Survive was able to do at the time. They had very limited access. They did a lot with it, and they told great stories. But now that all the sports properties are like, oh, we need a Drive to Survive, normally that means they want to control the narrative. And most of the production companies know that that's not going to work. And that creates this, some of them might do a deal in the end, but ultimately it can fall a little bit short because that control is what takes away the entertainment part. And these things can't always tell the right story. They have to be entertaining almost more. I mean, we've seen that with Drive to Survive, right? I don't know if you watched it much, but like you'll get races they'll show footage from like different races or just completely irrelevant to the moment. It's not actually telling the story of what the race was. They all put things together, take random commentary from different parts of the race that weren't actually said at the time of that incident happening, just to tell the story of entertainment. As long as you accept that, you can create great content that is entertaining to a much wider group. So I think the Drive to Survive, again, it's a bit like Netflix effect. It got people at the right time, was super successful, but it's really, really difficult to replicate. We haven't seen many that have done a good job of it to date.
So something we think maybe potentially is replicable. We had, Sergio Lopez from Live Mode and what he was doing at Casa TV down in Brazil. Do you expect to hear, or do you think there'll be people in Madrid that are going to be looking at that type of model in terms of using more influencer content alongside of, traditional live content? Is that something you expect more people to be talking about in Madrid? Do you think that's maybe still a little far off from people, which could potentially be just the nature of the fact they've got pre-existing broadcast deals that even if they wanted to try something, they might not even be able to?
Yeah. Well, before we get into that, I should actually say about my last point with the documentary stuff is I think that the challenge is that now there is just so much more of it. It's harder to stand out. Whereas Drive to Survive came in at a time, I couldn't tell you. I'm not an expert on what content what is better than the other, but also having the space of the market being basically void of anything else probably helped Drive to Survive a lot to be successful. So I shouldn't say that the other ones aren't good. They might be just as good in hindsight, but they just have more competition to stand out. But on the live mode, the influencer side, naturally that is a huge area of growth. The role that influencers are playing across the entire sports media landscape of general sports content, not just the live broadcast. I mean, the Kaze TV example is a fascinating one because it was almost like the hand was forced and they needed to do something disruptive and different to give themselves any chance. And it turned out there's a huge marketplace for that type of stuff. There's other examples like people knows watch along style shows where there's commentators talking about what's happening and they're not even seeing the live broadcast that do incredibly well around the Premier League and alike. So I think those shows are here to stay. The trick or the challenge is that whole, I guess, mismatch between the ability to directly monetize that, or for an influencer to say, yeah, I'll pay you millions and millions of pounds for the access to that against that traditional media rights model. They have to be ready to say, hey, we're going to share the upside, share the benefits and the profits from this initiative, not I need a check beforehand. And I think most sports are getting, again, aware of that sort of thing. I think with live mode, I can't remember if we covered that, but I imagine there was some sort of commitment by live mode that they took a risk to get that Kaze TV deal done at the time because they were also acting as the agency to sell those rights in the market. So look, I think you're going to see more and more people try different things like that to try and move the needle, to try and make an impact. You can get more rights getting carved out. Because we're seeing less of those media rights deals, you're just going to see more content in more different places. Less content being exclusive, more of it being non-exclusive and being in lots of different forums and destinations. So influencer TV, free to air deal if you can get it, on your own and operator platforms. It'll just be everywhere. And the net benefit, the way it's going to be monetized, is through sponsorship deals, advertising deals, and e-commerce solutions. And that's going to be the mix that everyone's going to be focused on for the near future.
Well, those three things you just listed there lead perfectly into the second pillar, which is being around monetization, which we touched on a little bit. You know, when I came in 5 years ago, it was all about subscriptions. Subscriptions, that was the thing. Everybody was, how do you get it? How do you prevent churn? Whereas now you're seeing all these people offer, you know, freemium models. They're offering, you know, ad revenue models, you know, Netflix. I mean, I think Peacock actually removed their ad model, but they ran that for a little bit. And then last year, might have even been 2 years ago, you know, fast channels was all the talk. I feels like fast has slowed down a little bit, maybe perhaps at least for me, but just from what I hear in conversations. But the advertisement side of it definitely is not necessarily slowed down. But when we kind of talk about monetization, Nick, you know, you did also talk about the e-commerce, which is different from the traditional broadcast side, but it is kind of all tied into how those different things can connect. For you, sort of, where do you see the big side of monetization, or what you expect to hear people talking about in Madrid?
Yeah, I think that we're going to see much more maturity around the e-commerce piece about how can people turn these eyeballs into something, whether it be through big tech platforms or owned and operated. We have started to see what Amazon are doing. They're trying to do more of that e-commerce offering in some of their stuff they're doing with like Black Friday, with their NFL rights, and all that stuff. Normally, when you see that at that level, that's what it will start to trickle down to other mediums. So a lot more complexity around how to try and bring that to life. I think you're going to see more and more around just advertising generally. So, for example, there's companies like, I think I've mentioned them a couple of times now, but I think they're really interesting. The Transmit guys who are incidentally, one of the sponsors for the event, but I do think are also so well positioned because everyone has, so every sports team or league has a commercial business that they are trying to bring partners on. That can be a really difficult role to be able to go to market and sell major sponsorship deals. But if you also have the ability to push both those sponsors, but also say brands that aren't at that level into advertising through your own and operated channels, through the streaming content you are doing, then I think that's a really big opportunity to sort of like fill out the middle ground, I suppose, between what the big home run swing of the big major sponsors of your league or team and having something in the middle there. So advertising, I think, is going to be a huge, huge topic. What role it plays, how to use it on your own content well, how to fit it into any existing platforms you might get, and how to get the maximum value out of it. Because the problem with platforms like YouTube is, whilst YouTube is great at connecting with audiences, if you commit your time and effort to it, the actual cost per thousand on that is really low, really, really low compared to every other platform. So they're willing to work with people to try and drive that up. But you know, if you can do it yourself, you're going to generate, in terms of going to market and selling it, you're going to generate a lot more returns if you can get that right.
Now, moving on to the last pillar, talking about technology, we've talked a little bit about just all those things we talked about, all the content, all the monetization bit. It's almost like it's the equivalent of talking about the quarterbacks and wide receivers in football, but the technology is the offensive line. It's the thing that maybe doesn't always get talked about as much, but you're only as good as your offensive line, or in this case, you're only as good as your technology. You know, you can have great content, but if you can't deliver it at scale, you know, we saw what, you know, has happened in the past, even when one of the biggest companies in the world, you know, Amazon struggled with their first Thursday night football of the NFL, and they're about as rich as it gets. Or Serie A in Italy with DAZN. Like, we've seen that, you know, you can have all those other bits, but if you don't have the technology side ready, it is a bit of a struggle. And, you know, I think AI is the obvious one to talk about, Nick, because it's such a buzzword, but it does feel a bit like we need a bit more specific when we talk about AI. You can't just use it as a catch-all term. Like, we've got to be a little bit more kind of directed as to what that actually means for the sports industry. You know, some of that stuff, you know, our partners like Magnify, WSC, what they're doing with automated highlight clips. But there's also the production side, the delivery, the CDN networks, and all those sorts of things. For you, Nick, technology-wise, what do you think is really kind of the big thing at the moment?
The big thing is it is everything to do with AI. But let's take word AI out of it. It's the big thing is, how do we streamline the way we work to be run more efficiently, more effectively, and how can we drive as much value financially out of those rights? And that's the mix you see. You see companies basically doing both. How do you create more content more effectively? And some of it might be driving more, just doing more, how do we do more and more and more content to try and drive more and more value and hope it at least goes up in a straight line in terms of the growth that it can bring? Or how can you basically put some of the tools in people's hands to help them drive more ROI out of the different areas we've talked about, whether it be e-commerce sales, it could be retail or ticketing sales, it could be marketing of your respective commercial partners, marketing other events, initiatives, that sort of stuff. It's basically putting more tools in the hands of sports teams, leagues, and the platforms themselves, but also loads at the tier 2, tier 3 level, the ones that are really having to take a lot of the control. Because you look at the tier 1 properties, and we even seen when we've talked about what the NFL is doing, they're actually sort of stepping away a little bit from that because they've got people that are willing enough to give them a big check to take on that responsibility for them on their behalf because they want to monetize it their own ways, whereas everyone else has to do it themselves. So it's tools to enable production, more content, more cloud-based solutions, basically move things in a more automated fashion, and then ultimately turning out the content into how do you distribute it as effectively as possible across as many platforms as possible, and then also how do you make sure we're getting as much monetization out of it, which is still has been the theme for a while now, but just that the depth on the number of options of monetization are growing and growing and growing. So we're going to see how that's going to shape up over the coming 6 to 12 months. Like e-commerce it's been a topic for a while, but it's not been something that a lot have been able to implement. And we're still only early stages for that, particularly for those smaller tier organizations. And just finally, what you're seeing on the tech front is that they're getting asked to put a proof of concept together, to basically come to a sports team or league, say, well, how much money do you think your technology can help us generate? Because it's difficult even for these teams and leagues and platforms sometimes to work out, well, if we add this layer of monetization or this new tool of monetization, how is that going to generate more income for us? We can't really see it. And that's where there's almost like a shared, so they're basically telling the tech companies, hey, come and tell us how much it's going to bring to us, and then we'll agree a deal based on those parameters, which is making it trickier for the tech companies as well to navigate. But it's kind of giving the help that the rights owners need because they don't really know how to work it out because everyone's trying to work it out on the fly.
How much of this tech is coming from outside of sports versus how much of it is endemic? What I mean by that is in the
Loads.
sense of
Yeah.
we've sort of like when I speak to some companies, they're nervous about investing in sports only tech solutions because the reality is sports is a small market compared to the rest of the media market. So how much of this tech is, people that aren't necessarily exclusively in sports that are trying to bring their solutions into sports versus how much of them really truly are endemic just to the sports world?
It's a great question. I don't know the stats, but it is the majority of them. By far, the majority is companies that serve more wider media entertainment and that have a bespoke or either have a bespoke approach or just think they have something that's transferable to sports. Obviously, with sports has a unique characteristics when it comes to the live broadcast production because of its pressure that it puts onto delivery and distribution of that. But more generally, it's normally outside of sports where that stuff's coming from. There's a handful of companies that are sports only and sports dedicated. But even I look at some of them and I'm like, well, that is super relevant to any media and entertainment business. And I wonder whether you basically just see that inevitably happening. They start in sports, they end up broadening, or they start in media and they end up broadening to sports. I think it goes sort of both ways.
Yeah, well, I have heard and where it came from. I know our COO, John Abraham, uses a term, but sports being the Trojan horse in the sense of, you might use sports as the way to get into the bigger media companies, where you want to get those solutions where someone might see your product because sports obviously has such a high affinity for people that it may open up doors, elsewhere. I mean, I think about BAM Tech with Major League Baseball back in the day. That was something Major League Baseball built for themselves and then ended up selling it off to Disney. So sports can at least, if nothing else, potentially be a way to get your product seen if you are trying to move into other verticals.
Well, that's how big tech's been leaning into sports for some time. That's why Salesforce and AWS we're doing deals with people like Formula One because they want it to be seen and then use that as a sales tool. And it works pretty similar. You would see that most of these media tech companies definitely use sports as the asset to market themselves and say, look, hey, if we can deliver this in sports, we can definitely deliver what you need. That's for sure.
Yeah. So the last thing we'll touch on, Nick, because it is a part of the SportsPro Madrid overall 2-day experience, is the SportsPro OTT Awards. Believe, Nick, we're coming up on year number 6 now, year number 5. I think, let's put it this way, Nick. I've been at SportsPro for just over 5 years now, and the first year we did it was the year I was here. So maybe it's 5. It's at least 5. It's at least 5, maybe 6. But we've been doing the OTT Awards for a while now, and we obviously will have to speak quite cryptically because winners won't be announced until then. But Nick, you and I, along with about 68 other judges, about 70 in total from across the globe. Some of them are major rights holders, some of them are major broadcasters, some of them are more niche sports, some of them are just general experts. Our friend Magnus Svensson, who's a big sports pro. I got to give him a shout out, Nick. I just love Magnus so much. There's a whole compilation of different people. This year, Nick, did anything in particular stick out to you about some of the different applications that you read through for the awards?
Yeah, I think the main thing I've started to see a lot more of, a couple of points we've covered already in terms of what we'd see at Madrid, is just there's now real success stories of not only servicing and delivering value to sports, but also delivering real value to tier 2 and tier 3 sports, and bringing to life, I guess, like a group of people that were historically being underserved. So there's various examples of, like, let's say no, I wouldn't even call them grassroots. Let's call them grassroots for now, for the sake of it, in general terms, or maybe a semi-pro league which has never been able to get their content out to the right places, and definitely not able to turn that into monetization. There is a bunch of examples where the tools and the keys and the different ways of delivering that, both live and non-live content, the tools have been given to them, and it's turned into real revenue and real audiences and real success stories. Even though people might go, "Oh, that's a tin pot lead. They're not going to be able to do anything." Actually, no, they're doing all right. They are definitely generating enough return and value for all the stakeholders, not just in monetization, but also reach and strategic value. That we've been waiting for more of these examples, and there's more depth to them because of the complexities we've talked about in the last 30 odd minutes about how the industry is becoming. Trying to find new ways of driving value. Well, there's actually some that are already doing it. So that's a big thing. More on the social media side, there's just loads more on what role social's playing, how to distribute their content, how to turn that into monetization. We're seeing more examples. Companies getting a little bit better at sharing more insights and data behind some of their entries, which is good, because otherwise they just say they do a good job, but some still do that, just send an entry and telling us they do a really good job, but don't give it any substance. Now it's good to see a few of them backing that up, but maybe it's because we're putting more pressure on them to do so. But that's really it. I think it's just more case studies, more examples of more companies and more teams, leagues, and platforms, big and small, but particularly the small ones, really getting success in a marketplace they've historically, your fans basically of those smaller clubs and teams have never been able to get access, and even the marketing of them has been really difficult to say, hey, this product exists. Well, you still have to work out how to get them there. And that's now working, which is really cool.
Well, what I find interesting is it feels like sports, because of everything it has to compete against, standards are so high. And where I'm getting at this is one of the categories was around best in fan engagement. And a lot of the comments from judges were like, I would love to see fan engagement that just isn't polls or trivia or quizzes. Like, there's a time like that was really great. You're just in the middle watching a sport and it's like, oh, who's the last time someone achieved this? Or what do you think about this player? Like, there was a moment that felt like, innovative, you're interacting with the stream and all that. And I think it just goes to show, like, sort of what people's expectations are, not just because of like the sports broadcast, but just general broadcast. It feels like people are going to be pushing and asking more and more of what they want their broadcast to look like from an engagement perspective. And I just thought it was interesting, stuff that was deemed to be innovative a couple years ago, partly because it's just difficult to pull off at scale with ultra low latency and all that. 2 years later, people are like, okay, give me something new. And it's just been like, the expectation, the standard of what people want on these platforms just seems to be getting higher and higher.
Completely. I think this, as we're seeing a gross maturity across the industry, the depth of what everyone's expecting and needs, and we're seeing is getting better and better. Because I think sports hasn't really known what it wants. It just wants something. We need to drive fan engagement. We don't really know how. We'll take whatever you've got. Now, actually, there's some real good examples of stuff that can actually work there.
Absolutely. Well, Nick, I appreciate you. It's always great to sit down and talk. And I managed to not talk about how miserable the Bengals are. So, just a good old day at Stream Time.
I wasn't going to bring it up. I'm leaving that to you to bring up. Where you want to bring up the Bungles of old back, or just leave that. I'll leave that to that late season run that they normally have, which they need to get moving sooner or later.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsPro Nick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Stream Timers. Until next time.